October 1950. Zhou Enlai, China's premier and chief diplomat, has spent weeks trying to prevent war with America through every diplomatic channel available. He has issued warnings, sent messages through neutral countries, made public statements explaining China's security concerns. All of this has been ignored by MacArthur, who is certain China is bluffing and pushes American forces toward the Chinese border anyway. Now Zhou must go to Mao Zedong and his military commanders with a recommendation. China has no choice but to fight. What Zhou says in this moment reveals a diplomat who has exhausted every peaceful option, who understands the catastrophic cost of the war that is about to begin, but who recognizes that MacArthur has left China with no alternative. This is not about ideology or communist expansion. This is about a general who refused to listen, forcing a nation into war it desperately wanted to avoid. Subscribe for more MacArthur stories and help us reach 500 subscribers. Zhou Enlai is not a military leader. He is diplomat and strategist who has spent his career managing China's relationships with the outside world. In the fall of 1950, his task is to prevent Chinese intervention in Korea if possible, because he understands better than most Chinese leaders the catastrophic costs such intervention would entail. China has just emerged from decades of civil war and Japanese occupation. The economy is devastated. The population is exhausted. The military lacks modern equipment and has no air force capable of challenging American air power. Fighting the United States, the world's most powerful military force, seems like national suicide. Zhou's job is to make clear to America that China will intervene if American forces approach the Yalu River, while simultaneously hoping that this warning will deter American advance and make intervention unnecessary. What makes Zhou's diplomatic position so difficult is that Chinese leadership is genuinely uncertain about whether intervention is wise policy. Mao Zedong and some military leaders believe intervention is necessary to protect Chinese security, regardless of costs. Other leaders argue that China is too weak to fight America, and that intervention would destroy the communist revolution that has just succeeded after decades of struggle. Zhou himself is somewhere in the middle, believing that intervention is necessary if American forces reach the Yalu River, but hoping desperately that clear warnings will prevent that situation from arising. His diplomatic efforts during September and October are attempts to find middle path where China's security concerns are respected and war is avoided. The warnings Zhou issues through diplomatic channels are carefully calibrated to be taken seriously without being so threatening that they provoke the confrontation China wants to avoid. Through Indian Ambassador K.M. Panikkar, Zhou tells American officials that China cannot accept American forces on its border and will be forced to intervene if United Nations forces cross the 38th parallel. Through public statements in Chinese media, Zhou emphasizes China's peaceful intentions while making clear that China will defend its security interests. Through messages sent through neutral countries, Zhou explains that Chinese intervention would be defensive response to American aggression, not offensive action by China. All of these warnings are designed to give America clear understanding of what will trigger Chinese intervention while leaving room for diplomatic resolution. What Zhou says privately to Mao and Chinese leadership during this period reveals his frustration with the constraints he faces. He tells them that American leadership, particularly MacArthur, does not take Chinese warnings seriously because they assume China is too weak to intervene effectively. Zhou argues that this is dangerous misunderstanding of Chinese capabilities and Chinese determination, but he also acknowledges that China has limited tools to convince America of its seriousness without actually demonstrating military capability through intervention. The diplomatic paradox is that the only way to make American leadership believe Chinese warnings is to prove those warnings through action, but taking such action means war that China wants to avoid. The critical moment comes in early October when it becomes clear that MacArthur intends to cross the 38th parallel and advance toward the Yalu River, despite Chinese warnings. Zhou makes final attempt through panic car, delivering clear message that Chinese intervention will occur if American forces cross into North Korea. The message is unambiguous and official, representing Chinese government position rather than propaganda or unofficial threat. Zhou knows this is likely the last chance to prevent war through diplomacy. When MacArthur orders American forces across the 38th parallel anyway, just days after Zhou's final warning, the diplomat recognizes that his mission has failed. China will have to fight, because MacArthur has forced the choice between accepting American forces on Chinese border or defending Chinese security through military action that will cost hundreds of thousands of lives. When Zhou Enlai goes to Chinese leadership in mid-October 1950 to recommend military intervention in Korea, it is one of the most consequential decisions any diplomat has ever made. Zhou knows he is recommending war against the world's most powerful military force, war that will devastate China economically and cost enormous casualties. But he also believes that MacArthur has left China no alternative. American forces approaching the Yalu River create permanent security threat that China cannot accept. The revolution that brought communists to power, the government that Zhou helps lead, will never be secure if hostile American military power is permanently positioned on Chinese border. The diplomatic solution Zhou sought has failed because MacArthur refused to take Chinese warnings seriously. Now military solution is the only option remaining. What Zhou says to Mao and the Politburo reveals careful strategic reasoning behind his recommendation for intervention. He argues that fighting now, when American forces are overextended and overconfident, offers better odds than waiting until America consolidates control of Korea and turns attention to threatening China directly. He emphasizes that Chinese intervention can be framed as defensive response to American aggression, which will provide political legitimacy both domestically and internationally. He notes that Stalin has promised Soviet support in the form of weapons and air cover, though Zhou is careful not to overstate the reliability of Stalin's commitments. Most importantly, Zhou argues that failing to intervene will signal weakness that will encourage American pressure on China in future crises. The resistance to Zhou's recommendation comes primarily from military commanders who understand the costs of fighting American forces better than political leaders do. General Peng Dehuai, who will command Chinese forces in Korea, warns that American air power will inflict horrific casualties on Chinese troops. Other commanders note that Chinese soldiers lack winter equipment for fighting in Korean mountains, and that supply lines will be vulnerable to American air attacks. Zhou acknowledges all of these concerns, but argues that the strategic necessity of preventing American forces from occupying all of Korea outweighs these tactical challenges. China cannot base its security policy on hope that America will not use Korea as base to threaten China. China must act while military situation offers some possibility of success, even though costs will be terrible. What distinguishes Zhou's recommendation from pure military calculation is his emphasis on political and diplomatic dimensions of intervention. He tells Chinese leadership that how intervention is conducted matters almost as much as whether it succeeds militarily. Chinese forces must be portrayed as volunteers defending Korean sovereignty, not as Chinese army invading Korea. The intervention must be framed as response to American aggression crossing 38th parallel, not as Chinese offensive action. International opinion, particularly opinion in countries allied with America, must see Chinese intervention as defensive and necessary, rather than as communist expansion. Zhou understands that even if Chinese military intervention succeeds in pushing American forces back from the Yalu River, China will need diplomatic support and will need to avoid being completely isolated internationally. The final argument Zhou makes for intervention is that MacArthur's arrogance and his dismissal of Chinese warnings have created optimal conditions for Chinese military success. American forces are advancing rapidly, splitting into separated columns, prioritizing speed over security because MacArthur is certain Chinese intervention is not coming. Chinese forces have been infiltrating into North Korea undetected, positioned to attack when American forces are most vulnerable. The combination of MacArthur's overconfidence and Chinese preparation creates opportunity that will not exist if China waits. Zhou tells Chinese leadership that if intervention is necessary, now is the best moment tactically and strategically. Mao accepts this reasoning, and the decision is made. China will intervene, and Zhou's diplomatic efforts will be replaced by military campaign that will cost hundreds of thousands of lives and will fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Cold War in Asia. If you're learning how MacArthur's actions shaped global events, subscribe to help us reach 500 subscribers. One of Zhou Enlai's most important contributions to Chinese strategy in Korea is his framework for fighting limited war with clear objectives that can be achieved without triggering American escalation that China cannot match. Zhou understands that China cannot defeat America in total war. Chinese forces cannot win air war against American air power. China cannot survive American nuclear attack if the war escalates to that level. But Zhou believes China can fight limited war with specific objective of pushing American forces away from Chinese border and creating stalemate that makes diplomatic resolution possible. This requires discipline to avoid provocations that would justify American escalation while maintaining sufficient military pressure to achieve Chinese security objectives. What Zhou says about the objectives of Chinese intervention reveals sophisticated understanding of limited war that MacArthur never demonstrates. Zhou tells Chinese military commanders that their mission is not to conquer South Korea or to unify peninsula under communist control. Those ambitious objectives would require total war that China cannot win. Instead, the mission is defensive. Push American forces back from the Yalu River, demonstrate that China will defend its security interests, and create military situation where armistice near the 38th parallel becomes acceptable outcome for all parties. This limited objective means Chinese forces do not need to achieve total victory. They need to inflict sufficient casualties on American forces to make continued American advance toward Chinese border politically and militarily unsustainable. The restrictions Zhou insists upon reveal his concern about avoiding escalation. He tells military commanders that Chinese forces must not cross into South Korea proper if possible, because doing so could be portrayed as Chinese offensive action rather than defensive response. Chinese forces should not attack American bases in Japan, even though doing so might have tactical benefits, because such attacks would clearly expand the war beyond Korea. Chinese diplomacy should continue even as military operations proceed, leaving door open for negotiations that could end the fighting once Chinese security objectives are achieved. All of these restrictions are designed to keep the war limited in scope and to avoid giving America justification for escalation that would play to American strengths rather than Chinese strengths. Zhou's framework for limited war requires political discipline that military commanders sometimes resist. When Chinese forces achieve spectacular tactical successes in late November and December 1950, pushing American forces back in disarray, some Chinese military leaders advocate for pursuing American forces aggressively and attempting to drive them completely off the Korean peninsula. Zhou argues against this approach. He notes that pushing too far south would stretch Chinese supply lines, would make Chinese forces vulnerable to American counterattacks, and would eliminate the defensive justification for Chinese intervention. Zhou wants Chinese forces to stop roughly at the 38th parallel, demonstrating Chinese capability while avoiding overreach that MacArthur exemplified when he pushed to the Yalu River. What makes Zhou's limited war framework historically significant is that it works exactly as he predicts. Chinese intervention pushes American forces back from the Yalu River, demonstrates Chinese resolve and military capability, and creates military stalemate that makes negotiations possible. The war eventually ends with armistice near the 38th parallel, achieving Chinese core objective of preventing American forces from occupying all of Korea. This outcome validates Zhou's strategic vision and demonstrates that limited war with clearly defined objectives can serve Chinese interests better than ambitious campaigns seeking total victory. MacArthur's failure to understand limited war, his insistence on total victory or nothing, is precisely what created the crisis that made Chinese intervention necessary and what limited his effectiveness as commander once that intervention occurred. Zhou Enlai understands that Chinese intervention in Korea will carry heavy diplomatic costs that China will bear for years or decades. Intervention will confirm Western suspicions that Communist China is aggressive expansionist power. It will make diplomatic recognition of Chinese government by Western countries much more difficult. It will strengthen American commitment to defending Taiwan and will likely mean permanent American military presence in Asia that China will have to deal with indefinitely. Zhou calculates all of these costs and concludes that they are worth paying to prevent American forces from establishing themselves on Chinese border, but he never minimizes the diplomatic damage that intervention will cause. What Zhou says to Chinese leadership about managing diplomatic costs reveals his understanding that how China conducts the intervention matters for long-term consequences. He emphasizes that China must maintain that its forces are volunteers, not official Chinese military, to preserve some degree of deniability about Chinese government responsibility. He argues that China must continue to profess peaceful intentions and willingness to negotiate even while fighting, to counter narrative that China is purely aggressive power. He insists that Chinese forces must avoid atrocities and must treat prisoners according to international law, both because it is morally correct and because violations would create propaganda victories for American side that would damage Chinese standing internationally. The immediate diplomatic cost Zhou faces is isolation from Western countries that might otherwise have been open to eventual diplomatic recognition of Communist China. Britain, which has significant interests in Asia and which was moving toward recognition of Chinese government, becomes much more cautious after Chinese intervention. Other Western European countries that might have pursued independent China policy follow American lead in treating China as threat rather than as potential diplomatic partner. Even neutral countries that tried to mediate between China and America become wary of Chinese intentions. Zhou's diplomatic efforts over the following years will be devoted partly to repairing this damage and demonstrating that China is a rational actor interested in stability rather than aggressive revolutionary power. Zhou also must manage China's relationship with the Soviet Union, which becomes more complex after Chinese intervention. Stalin provides weapons and some air support, but Soviet assistance is less than Stalin promised and comes with conditions that Zhou finds troubling. Stalin uses Chinese dependence on Soviet military support to extract economic concessions and to pressure China to accept Soviet influence over Chinese domestic policy. Zhou must balance need for Soviet support to sustain military operations in Korea against desire to maintain Chinese independence from Soviet domination. This delicate diplomatic management will characterize Sino-Soviet relations for the next decade and will eventually lead to split between China and Soviet Union that Zhou will have to navigate carefully. What Zhou says about the broader diplomatic costs of intervention reveals his long-term strategic thinking. He tells Chinese leadership that intervention will damage China's international standing in the short term, but that successfully defending Chinese security interests will establish China as major power that must be respected. Western countries may view China with hostility, but they will also recognize that China is capable of defending its interests militarily, and that China cannot be bullied or ignored in Asian affairs. This reputation for resolve and capability, purchased through the costs of Korean intervention, will serve Chinese interests in future crises by making potential adversaries think twice before threatening Chinese security. Zhou is thinking beyond immediate war to decades of Cold War, competition where Chinese credibility as determined defender of its interests will matter enormously. What Zhou Enlai said when MacArthur forced China into war was vindicated by both the military outcome and the strategic consequences of Chinese intervention. The immediate military result validated Zhou's assessment that Chinese forces could push American troops back from the Yalu River and create military stalemate, despite American technological superiority. The war ended in 1953 with armistice roughly at the 38th parallel, achieving Chinese core objective of preventing American forces from occupying all of Korea. This outcome confirmed Zhou's strategic judgment that limited war for limited objectives could serve Chinese security interests, even against far more powerful adversary. The broader strategic vindication came from how Chinese intervention changed China's international position. Before Korea, Western powers viewed Communist China as weak revolutionary government that might collapse, or that could be pressured and contained easily. After Korea, China was recognized as major military power capable of fighting United States to stalemate. This forced diplomatic recognition that China had to be taken seriously in Asian affairs, and that Chinese security concerns could not be ignored without consequences. Zhou spent the rest of his career leveraging this enhanced Chinese credibility in diplomatic negotiations, using reputation earned in Korea to advance Chinese interests in conflicts and negotiations throughout Asia. Zhou's framework for limited war became model for how China approached subsequent conflicts. In 1962, border war with India, China achieved limited military objectives and then stopped rather than pursuing total victory that would have been diplomatically costly. In Vietnam War, China provided support to North Vietnam, but carefully managed its involvement to avoid direct confrontation with American forces. In each case, Chinese strategy reflected Zhou's insight from Korea that limited objectives pursued with discipline and restraint often serve national interests better than ambitious campaigns seeking decisive victory. This sophisticated approach to use of military force distinguished Chinese strategy from Soviet approach and contributed to China's eventual emergence as more successful communist power. What makes Zhou's role in Chinese intervention historically significant is that it demonstrates how diplomatic wisdom can guide military action even in war that diplomacy failed to prevent. Zhou understood that war with America was catastrophe for China, but that MacArthur's advance to Yalu River made war necessary. Zhou's framework for how to fight that war, emphasizing limited objectives and avoiding unnecessary escalation, minimized the damage while achieving essential Chinese security goals. His attention to diplomatic dimensions, even during military operations, helped China manage international isolation and eventually reconstruct relationships with countries that were hostile during the war. Zhou's legacy is not preventing the war, because MacArthur made that impossible, but ensuring that the war China had to fight served Chinese interests as much as possible given terrible circumstances. The final assessment of Zhou's warnings and recommendations during the Korean crisis is that he was right about everything important, while MacArthur was wrong about everything that mattered. Zhou correctly assessed that China would intervene if American forces approached the Yalu River. MacArthur dismissed this as bluff. Zhou correctly predicted that Chinese forces could fight American forces to stalemate, despite technological disadvantages. MacArthur was certain American forces would easily defeat any Chinese intervention. Zhou understood that limited war for limited objectives was appropriate strategy for the situation. MacArthur insisted on total victory and rejected limitations as weakness. Zhou's wisdom was proven through outcomes that vindicated Chinese strategy, while MacArthur's certainty led to his dismissal and to recognition that his strategic judgment was fatally flawed. Subscribe to see more stories about how MacArthur's decisions changed history in ways he never anticipated.